What if I told you the worst thing the narcissist ever did to you wasn't born from hatred, but from a pain they have spent their entire life trying to outrun? Today you're going to discover the hidden truth that explains why some narcissists seem obsessed with hurting the very people who loved them most, and why understanding this truth can finally free you from carrying wounds that never belonged to you. If you've ever asked yourself, why would someone who claimed to love me intentionally cause so much pain? You're asking one of the most important psychological questions there is. Most people answer it by saying narcissists are simply cruel, evil, or heartless. But human beings are rarely that simple. Behind destructive behavior often lies a history that no one sees. That history never excuses abuse. It never makes manipulation acceptable, but it helps explain why the same painful patterns repeat over and over again. Stay until the end, because the final insight may completely change how you see both the narcissist and yourself. And if this conversation helps you understand experiences you've struggled to put into words, subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. These discussions help many people realize they are not alone in what they've lived through. One of the greatest misunderstandings about narcissistic behavior is the belief that the desire to hurt others comes from confidence or emotional superiority. In reality, people who repeatedly inflict emotional pain often carry wounds they have never learned to recognize, much less heal. This is not an excuse for abusive behavior, nor does it reduce accountability. Rather, it helps us understand that cruelty can sometimes emerge from an inner world dominated by fear, shame, and emotional disconnection. A narcissistic person often experiences vulnerability as something profoundly unsafe. Somewhere along the way, whether through chronic neglect, emotional inconsistency, excessive criticism, or environments where love depended on performance, they may have learned that exposing genuine feelings led to rejection or humiliation. Instead of developing the capacity to tolerate emotional pain, they built a protective identity that appears confident, superior, and invulnerable. The tragedy is that this protective identity must be defended at all costs. Whenever another person reflects authenticity, emotional security, or healthy self-worth, it can unconsciously awaken the buried pain the narcissistic individual has spent years trying to keep hidden. Rather than becoming curious about these uncomfortable emotions, they may project them outward. Projection allows them to experience someone else as the source of feelings that actually originate within themselves. If they feel inadequate, they accuse others of being inadequate. If they feel rejected, they convince themselves they have been wronged. If they carry deep shame, they seek ways to make someone else feel ashamed instead. Hurting another person temporarily shifts their attention away from their own internal suffering. For a brief moment, the discomfort inside feels quieter because it has been transferred into someone else's emotional experience. This relief is short-lived, which is why the cycle repeats. Each act of manipulation, criticism, humiliation, or emotional control becomes another attempt to escape feelings that remain unresolved beneath the surface. Understanding this pattern helps explain why their behavior can seem relentless. The injury they create in others is often connected to an injury they cannot bear to acknowledge within themselves, leaving them trapped in a cycle where causing pain becomes a misguided attempt to avoid their own. For many narcissistic individuals, control is not simply about getting their own way. It functions as a psychological survival strategy that protects them from emotions they experience as overwhelming or unbearable. Most people develop emotional safety through relationships where they feel accepted, comforted, and valued even when they make mistakes. They gradually learn that conflict does not always lead to abandonment and that vulnerability can exist alongside love. When these experiences are missing or deeply inconsistent, a person may grow up believing that safety depends on controlling what other people think, feel, and do. Instead of trusting relationships, they attempt to manage them. This helps explain why a narcissistic person often reacts so intensely when someone establishes boundaries or begins making independent choices. To an emotionally healthy person, another individual's autonomy is a normal part of life. To someone whose inner world is built on fragile emotional foundations, that same independence can feel like a direct threat. They may experience it as rejection, disrespect, or even betrayal, not because those things are actually happening, but because their nervous system interprets a loss of control as a loss of security. Their response is often driven less by the present moment than by emotional patterns formed long before the current relationship existed. As a result, they may resort to manipulation, guilt, intimidation, criticism, or emotional withdrawal in an effort to restore a sense of stability. These behaviors are attempts to reduce their own anxiety by making the other person more predictable and easier to influence. The moment someone stops reacting in expected ways, refuses to engage in unhealthy dynamics, or maintains calm boundaries, the narcissistic individual may feel increasingly distressed. Their efforts to regain control often intensify because they believe controlling the relationship will also calm the turmoil inside them. The painful reality is that no amount of external control can create genuine emotional safety. Real security comes from the ability to face vulnerability, process difficult emotions, and maintain meaningful connections without domination or manipulation. Because these capacities remain underdeveloped, the narcissistic individual continues chasing control, hoping it will provide the peace that can only emerge through emotional awareness and healing, leaving every relationship shaped by fear rather than genuine trust. One of the most confusing experiences for people involved with a narcissistic individual is discovering that healthy independence often provokes hostility instead of respect. You begin making decisions for yourself, strengthening your boundaries, reconnecting with your own values, or simply living without seeking constant approval, and rather than celebrating your growth, they become increasingly critical, controlling, or emotionally distant. This reaction is rarely about the specific choices you are making. It is about what your independence represents within their psychological world. A person with healthy emotional development can recognize that love and autonomy coexist. Someone else's freedom does not diminish their own worth. For a narcissistic individual, however, another person's independence can unconsciously stir deep fears of abandonment, humiliation, or emotional insignificance. These fears are often rooted in experiences that taught them relationships were unstable, conditional, or tied to power rather than mutual trust. Instead of developing confidence that genuine connection can survive differences and distance, they learn to rely on control, admiration, or constant reassurance. When you no longer revolve around their emotional needs, it can feel to them as though something essential is slipping away. They may not consciously recognize this fear. Instead, it is translated into anger, blame, accusations, or attempts to pull you back into familiar patterns of dependency. They convince themselves that you have become selfish, disloyal, or uncaring because acknowledging their own vulnerability would require facing emotions they have spent years defending against. This is why seemingly ordinary acts, such as saying no, spending time with supportive friends, pursuing personal goals, or expressing a different opinion, can trigger reactions that appear wildly disproportionate. The issue is not the behavior itself, but the meaning attached to it. Your independence becomes evidence, in their mind, that they are losing influence, importance, or protection from feelings they cannot regulate internally. Their attempts to diminish your confidence or question your decisions are often efforts to restore the emotional balance they believe has been disrupted. Recognizing this dynamic allows you to see that your healthy growth is not the problem. The discomfort arises because your increasing emotional freedom confronts a system that depends on control to avoid deeply buried fears of rejection and inadequacy. One of the hidden dynamics behind narcissistic behavior is that causing emotional pain can become a temporary way of escaping their own inner distress. This does not mean they consciously plan every hurtful action as a form of emotional regulation. Rather, over time, they may have learned that when they feel overwhelmed by shame, insecurity, envy, or helplessness, directing those feelings outward provides brief relief. Instead of sitting with painful emotions and understanding where they come from, they attempt to reduce the discomfort by making someone else carry it. The emotional burden is shifted rather than resolved. Shame is particularly important to understand because it differs from ordinary guilt. Guilt says, "I made a mistake." Shame says, "There is something fundamentally wrong with me." For many narcissistic individuals, even small disappointments, criticism, or perceived rejection can awaken this deeper sense of defectiveness. Since acknowledging these feelings threatens the carefully constructed image they present to the world, they instinctively defend against them. They may ridicule another person, dismiss their feelings, blame them for problems, or deliberately undermine their confidence. These actions create a temporary illusion that they are powerful instead of vulnerable. For the person on the receiving end, the experience can be deeply confusing. You may begin questioning your own worth, wondering whether you are truly the problem or trying harder to earn kindness that seems to disappear the moment you get close. Meanwhile, the narcissistic individual experiences a brief reduction in their own emotional discomfort because attention has shifted away from their internal pain. Unfortunately, this relief never lasts. The underlying shame remains untouched because it has not been understood, processed, or healed. As a result, the cycle repeats whenever emotional discomfort returns. Another conflict is created, another criticism is delivered, another manipulation unfolds, or another attempt is made to leave someone else feeling small. Each episode functions like a temporary anesthetic rather than a cure. It dulls the pain for a moment, but does nothing to address its source. Understanding this pattern helps explain why the hurt they cause can seem repetitive and disproportionate. Their behavior is driven by an ongoing effort to escape emotional wounds that continue to shape their reactions beneath the surface, even while remaining largely outside their conscious awareness. Before we continue, if you're finding value in this discussion, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Every week we explore the deeper emotional patterns behind trauma, relationships, healing, and human behavior so you can stop surviving your past and begin understanding it. Now let's continue. One of the most unsettling experiences in a relationship with a narcissistic individual is realizing that your healthiest qualities can become the very things that provoke their hostility. You might expect honesty, emotional maturity, compassion, or quiet confidence to strengthen the relationship, yet these qualities sometimes seem to intensify criticism, jealousy, or attempts to diminish you. This reaction is not because authenticity is harmful. It is because genuine emotional health can silently expose the painful gaps the narcissistic individual has spent years trying to avoid. Without saying a single word, your way of living becomes a mirror that reflects possibilities they struggle to tolerate within themselves. A person who is comfortable acknowledging mistakes, expressing vulnerability, or maintaining healthy boundaries demonstrates that self-worth does not have to depend on constant admiration or control. For someone whose identity has been organized around avoiding shame and protecting a fragile sense of self, witnessing this can be deeply unsettling. They may not consciously recognize what is happening. Instead, they experience an uncomfortable emotional tension without understanding its source. Rather than becoming curious about these feelings, they may attempt to eliminate the discomfort by discrediting the person who evokes it. If they can convince themselves that you are flawed, selfish, or unworthy, they no longer have to confront the possibility that your emotional stability highlights what they have not developed within themselves. This helps explain why personal growth often changes the dynamics of the relationship. As you become less dependent on external validation, more consistent in your boundaries, and more accepting of your own imperfections, you also become more difficult to manipulate. The strategies that once created confusion or guilt begin to lose their effectiveness. Instead of drawing you back into old patterns, they encounter someone who responds with calm clarity rather than fear. This shift can feel threatening because it removes the emotional leverage they once relied upon to maintain a sense of control. Your healing also challenges the unspoken belief that emotional pain must always be managed through domination, blame, or avoidance. By choosing accountability, self-awareness, and authentic connection, you demonstrate another way of living. That silent example can awaken emotions the narcissistic individual has long defended against, making your growth feel less like an inspiration and more like an uncomfortable reminder of the inner work they continue to resist. One of the most important shifts in understanding narcissistic behavior is recognizing that many of their hurtful reactions are less about who you are and more about how they attempt to regulate their own emotional distress. This does not mean every action is unconscious or that they bear no responsibility for the choices they make. They remain accountable for manipulation, intimidation, and emotional abuse. However, their behavior often begins with an internal discomfort they cannot tolerate. Instead of identifying and managing that discomfort in healthy ways, they seek immediate relief by changing the emotional state of the people around them. Emotionally secure individuals usually develop the ability to pause when they feel hurt, disappointed, or threatened. They can reflect on what they are experiencing, separate past wounds from present circumstances, and respond with greater awareness. A narcissistic individual often struggles with this capacity. Their emotional reactions can be immediate and intense because painful feelings quickly activate deeply rooted fears of rejection, shame, or inadequacy. Rather than asking themselves, "Why am I reacting so strongly?" they may instinctively conclude that someone else must be responsible for what they are feeling. This is why relatively minor situations can escalate into major conflicts. A simple disagreement may be experienced as disrespect. Constructive feedback may feel like a personal attack. A partner needing space may be interpreted as abandonment. Once these interpretations take hold, the narcissistic individual may attempt to regulate their distress by criticizing, blaming, gaslighting, or provoking emotional reactions in the other person. If they can make someone else feel guilty, defensive, frightened, or confused, their own inner tension may temporarily decrease because the focus has shifted away from their emotional pain. For those caught in this pattern, it is easy to believe they are constantly doing something wrong. They may spend enormous amounts of energy trying to prevent the next outburst by becoming more accommodating, more patient, or more self-sacrificing. Yet the problem does not lie in their inability to be perfect. It lies in the fact that no partner, friend, or family member can permanently regulate another person's unresolved emotional world. As long as distress continues to be managed through control of others instead of self-awareness, the same destructive cycle is likely to repeat, regardless of who happens to be standing in front of them. One of the deepest forms of healing after a relationship with a narcissistic person begins when you stop carrying responsibility for wounds that were never yours to heal. Many survivors leave these relationships believing they somehow failed, that if they had been more patient, more understanding, more loving, or less emotional, the outcome would have been different. This belief often develops gradually because narcissistic dynamics encourage people to question their own reality. Over time, blame is subtly transferred until you begin carrying emotional burdens that do not belong to you. You may find yourself apologizing for conflicts you did not create, explaining your intentions repeatedly, or feeling guilty for having ordinary human needs. This pattern can become especially powerful if you naturally care deeply about others. Empathy, compassion, and a desire to understand people's struggles are beautiful qualities, but they can also become traps when they lead you to excuse repeated mistreatment. Understanding that someone may have experienced neglect, criticism, or emotional pain earlier in life can help explain their behavior, but explanation is not the same as responsibility. Their history deserves compassion, yet it does not require you to sacrifice your own emotional well-being in an endless attempt to rescue them from pain they refuse to acknowledge or address. Healing involves learning to separate empathy from self-abandonment. It means recognizing that you can care about another person's suffering while also refusing to accept manipulation, intimidation, dishonesty, or emotional abuse. Healthy compassion includes boundaries because genuine care is never meant to come at the cost of your own dignity or psychological safety. As this understanding grows, you begin releasing the exhausting belief that your worth depends on fixing someone who repeatedly resists accountability. Gradually, you reclaim the emotional energy that was once consumed by trying to predict moods, prevent conflict, or earn approval that was always conditional. You begin trusting your own perceptions again, instead of constantly looking to someone else to define reality. The shame that was projected onto you slowly loses its grip because you recognize it was never an accurate reflection of who you are. In that space, your identity is no longer organized around managing another person's unresolved pain, but around reconnecting with your own values, boundaries, and capacity for authentic relationships built on mutual respect. One of the greatest gifts that comes from understanding the psychology behind narcissistic behavior is not that it changes the narcissistic person, but that it changes your relationship with your own experience. Many people spend years trapped in confusion, asking why the manipulation happened, why kindness was met with cruelty, or why every attempt to repair the relationship seemed to make things worse. Without understanding the underlying dynamics, it is easy to assume that if you could only find the right words, become more patient, or love more deeply, the relationship would finally become safe. Psychological insight gently dismantles that illusion by showing that the problem was never a lack of effort on your part. Understanding does not mean minimizing the damage that was done, nor does it require you to excuse abusive behavior. There is a common misconception that healing demands immediate forgiveness or reconciliation. In reality, genuine healing begins with seeing clearly. You can acknowledge another person's emotional wounds while also recognizing that they are responsible for how they choose to respond to those wounds. Compassion does not erase accountability, and empathy does not require continued exposure to harmful behavior. These truths can exist together without contradiction. As this perspective develops, you become less vulnerable to manipulation rooted in guilt, obligation, or false hope. Instead of interpreting every apology as evidence of lasting change, or every emotional display as proof of genuine self-awareness, you begin paying attention to consistent patterns of behavior. You learn that trust is built through repeated actions rather than persuasive words. This shift allows you to make decisions based on reality instead of the relationship you wished could exist. Perhaps most importantly, understanding frees you from carrying questions that have no satisfying answers. You no longer need to endlessly analyze every conversation or search for the perfect explanation that will make the past feel fair. Some people remain unwilling or unable to confront their own emotional world, and their resistance belongs to them, not to you. Your healing no longer depends on receiving validation, remorse, or closure from the person who caused the harm. Instead, it grows from your willingness to reclaim your own voice, trust your perceptions, honor your boundaries, and build relationships where respect, emotional safety, and mutual responsibility are shared rather than demanded. If there is one truth to carry with you today, let it be this: The narcissist's desire to hurt you was never a measure of your worth. It was a reflection of an inner world shaped by fear, unresolved shame, and emotional disconnection. Understanding this does not erase the pain you experienced, and it certainly does not excuse the choices they made. What it does is remove the burden of believing you were responsible for fixing what existed long before you entered their life. Healing begins the moment you stop asking, "What is wrong with me?" and start asking, "What happened here, and what do I need to move forward?" That shift changes everything. It allows you to step out of self-blame and into self-understanding. It reminds you that your empathy is a strength, but it should never require you to abandon yourself. Healthy love does not demand that you shrink, question your reality, or sacrifice your peace to make someone else feel secure. The truth they hide from everyone is not that they are powerful. It is that beneath the image they fight so hard to protect lies a profound fear of being seen as they truly feel inside. That fear can drive years of control, manipulation, and emotional harm. But it is not yours to carry. Your responsibility is not to rescue another person's unhealed wounds. Your responsibility is to protect your own well-being, reclaim your voice, and create relationships where honesty, respect, and emotional safety are freely given rather than painfully earned. If this message resonated with you, consider sharing it with someone who may still be questioning their own reality after a painful relationship. And if you're committed to understanding the deeper roots of trauma, healing, and human behavior, subscribe for more conversations that help transform confusion into clarity and pain into lasting growth.